She tracked enemies to protect her people. He led warriors to defend their homeland. But when hidden bruises revealed a darkness closer than any outside threat, the Paiute chief's next command would shake the very foundation of their mountain. Settlement. The high desert wind carried secrets across the Sierra Nevada foothills as dawn painted the sky in shades of copper and gold. Chief Raphael Stoneheart stood atop the granite outcropping that overlooked the Paiute settlement of Whispering Pines, his weathered hands gripping the carved elk bone staff that had belonged to his grandfather. At 43, he commanded the respect of every soul in the valley, from the youngest children who gathered around the evening fires to hear his stories, to the eldest council members who sought his wisdom in matters of war and peace.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Below him, the settlement stirred too. Life with the familiar rhythm that had sustained his people for generations. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Women emerged from their dwellings to tend gardens carved from the reluctant mountain soil. And children's laughter echoed off the canyon walls as they chased prairie dogs between the sagebrush. But Chief Stoneheart's keen eyes were focused on a single figure moving swiftly through the shadows at the settlement's eastern edge. Ember Starwing moved like her namesake, quick and bright against the muted colors of the high desert landscape. At 19, she was the finest scout the Whispering Pines band had produced in a generation, capable of tracking a mountain lion across bare rock or detecting the approach of cavalry from miles away by reading the flight patterns of disturbed birds. Her grandfather, Broken Arrow, had trained her in the old ways before his death 3 winters past, teaching her secrets of stealth and observation that few possessed. Chief Stoneheart watched as Ember approached the settlement's main fire. Circle, her distinctive red and black hair braids catching the morning light. Something about her movement pattern troubled him, though he couldn't immediately identify what. She moved with her usual grace, but there was a subtle hesitation in her step, a barely perceptible favoring of her left side that spoke to his warrior's instincts of injury or distress. As the settlement's protector and leader, Chief Stoneheart had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the signs of trouble among his people. 25 years of leadership had taught him that the greatest threats to his band often came not from the cavalry patrols that occasionally swept through their territory, or from the mining companies that coveted their sacred mountains, but from the wounds that festered in silence within their own community. Chief Stoneheart descended the rocky path with the fluid movement of a man who had spent his entire life navigating treacherous mountain terrain. His moccasins made no sound. On the granite, as he approached the main fire circle where Ember was preparing for what appeared to be another scouting mission, she knelt beside her gear, carefully arranging her weapons and supplies with the methodical precision he had always admired. "Ember Starwing," he called softly, using the formal tone that indicated official business rather than casual conversation. She looked up immediately, her dark eyes alert and respectful, but Chief Stoneheart noticed something that made his blood run cold. As she rose to acknowledge his presence, her doeskin shirt pulled taut across her ribs, and for just a moment, he glimpsed what appeared to be dark discoloration along her rib cage. "Chief Stoneheart," she replied, pressing her right hand to her heart in the traditional gesture of respect. "I was preparing to scout the northern passes. White Wolf reported unusual dust clouds yesterday evening, and I wanted to investigate before they moved closer to our territory." Her voice was steady, professional, but Chief Stoneheart detected an underlying tension that hadn't been there during their previous conversations. He studied her face more carefully, noting details that his initial observation had missed. There was a faint discoloration along her left jawline, so subtle that it would have been invisible to most observers, but unmistakable to someone trained in reading the signs of violence. Her movements, while still graceful, showed the careful control of someone working around pain. "The northern passes can wait," Chief Stoneheart said. his voice carrying the quiet authority that had guided his people through countless challenges. "Walk with me to the council lodge. There are matters we need to discuss." It wasn't a request, though his tone remained respectful of her status as one of his most valued scouts. Ember's eyes flickered with what might have been fear or uncertainty, but she nodded without hesitation. "Of course, Chief. Should I bring my scouting report from yesterday's patrol?" She began gathering her gear with movements that were just slightly too quick, betraying an anxiety that contradicted her calm demeanor. "Leave the gear," Chief Stoneheart said gently. "This conversation doesn't require maps or reports." He turned and walked toward the council lodge, a substantial structure, built from pine logs and covered with elk hide that served as both meeting place and sanctuary for serious tribal business. As he walked, he listened to Ember's footsteps behind him, noting the almost imperceptible irregularity in her gait. The council lodge stood at the heart of the Whispering Pines settlement, its entrance facing east toward the rising sun in Kohung. Accordance with ancient tradition, sacred symbols carved by generations of tribal artists adorned the wooden posts that supported the structure, telling the story of the Paiute people's long journey to this mountain sanctuary. Inside, buffalo robes and woven blankets created a warm, private space where the most important decisions affecting the tribe were made. Chief Stoneheart gestured for Ember to sit on one of the comfortable buffalo robes arranged around the Wayung's central fire pit, while he took his own place across from her. The morning light filtering through the smoke hole above cast patterns of shadow and illumination that seemed to emphasize the gravity of whatever conversation was about to unfold. "Ember Starwing," he began, using her full name again to indicate the formal nature of their discussion. "You have served this tribe with honor and distinction since you came of age. Your scouting abilities have kept us safe from countless threats, and your courage in the face of danger has inspired warriors twice your age." His words were sincere, but Ember seemed to sense that they were leading somewhere she didn't want to go. "Thank you, Chief," she replied carefully. "I have always tried to serve our people to the best of my abilities." Her hands rested in her lap, but Chief Stoneheart noticed that she kept them positioned to cover her ribs, a subtle protective gesture that spoke volumes about her current state of mind. Chief Stoneheart leaned forward slightly, his expression combining the stern authority of a leader with the compassionate concern of a father figure. "In all your years of service, have I ever given you reason to doubt that your welfare is important to me?" The question was designed to establish trust and create an opening for honest communication. Ember's eyes met his for a moment, before looking away toward the fire pit. "No, Chief. You have always been fair and protective of all your people." Her voice was barely above a whisper, and Chief Stoneheart could see her internal struggle playing out across her features. "Then help me understand why one of my finest scouts is carrying injuries that she's trying to hide from her chief," he said, his voice remaining gentle but unmistakably serious. The directness of his statement seemed to hit Ember like a physical blow, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around her torso in a protective gesture. For several long moments, the only sound in the council lodge was the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of hawks circling overhead. Ember stared into the flames as if they might provide answers to questions she wasn't ready to ask, while Chief Stoneheart waited with the infinite patience that had made him such an effective leader. "I don't know what you mean," Ember finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. The words seemed to cost her considerable effort, and Chief Stoneheart could see tears beginning to form in her eyes despite her attempts to maintain composure. Chief Stoneheart reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a small piece of polished obsidian, holding it up so that it caught and reflected the firelight. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, though he knew she would recognize the sacred stone immediately. "It's a truth stone," Ember replied, her voice barely audible. Every member of the tribe knew the significance of the obsidian pieces that had been blessed by the tribal shamans and used in the most solemn ceremonies. To speak falsely while a truth stone was present was considered one of the gravest violations of tribal law.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
I'm not asking you to confess to any wrongdoing, Chief Stoneheart said, placing the obsidian on the buffalo robe between them. I'm asking you to trust me with whatever burden you're carrying. The bruises on your ribs, the mark on your jaw, the way you're moving like someone who's trying not to aggravate injuries, these things tell a story that I need to hear. His words were spoken with such gentle authority that Ember's carefully maintained composure finally began to crack. Tears started flowing down her cheeks, and she made no attempt to wipe them away. Chief Stoneheart, if I tell you what's happening, it could destroy more than just my life. There are things about our tribe, about people you trust, that you might not want to know. Her voice was filled with a pain that went far deeper than any physical injury. The chief's expression hardened, not with anger toward Ember, but with the cold fury of a protector who was beginning to understand the true nature of the threat facing his people. Ember Starwing, I have led this tribe through cavalry attacks, through winters when food was scarce and medicine was running low, through conflicts with neighboring tribes and negotiations with government officials who viewed us as obstacles to their expansion. There is nothing you could tell me that would be more destructive than allowing someone in this tribe to continue hurting you. His words carried the weight of absolute conviction. Ember took a shuddering breath and looked directly at Chief Stoneheart for the first time since they had entered the lodge. It's war. Hawk, she said, the name emerging like a confession that had been trapped inside her for far too long. He's been hurting me for months, and I don't know how to make it stop. The admission seemed to drain her of remaining strength, and she slumped forward as if the weight of her secret had been physically crushing her. Chief Stoneheart's face went completely still, a dangerous calm that those who knew him well would recognize as the precursor to decisive action. War Hawk was his war chief, a man he had trusted with the lives of every person in the settlement, someone who had fought beside him in countless battles and shared his council fire for over a decade. The betrayal of that trust was staggering in its implications. Tell me everything, he said, his voice carrying a command that brooked no evasion or minimization. From the beginning. When did this start, and how has it progressed? He needed to understand the full scope of what had been happening under his leadership without his knowledge. Ember wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and began speaking, in a voice that grew stronger as she continued. It started 4 months ago, after I returned from the extended scouting mission to track the cavalry patrol near Eagle's Peak. Warhawk said he needed to debrief me privately about what I had observed. So I met him at his lodge after the evening meal. Her hands trembled slightly as she recalled the beginning of her ordeal. He asked normal questions at first about the soldiers' numbers, their equipment, their apparent destination. But then he started asking about my personal life, about whether I was lonely spending so much time away from the settlement, about whether I had considered taking a husband. Ember's voice carried a mixture of anger and humiliation as she described how the conversation had shifted from professional to personal. Chief Stoneheart listened without interruption, but his jaw tightened with each detail. Warhawk's behavior represented not just a personal betrayal, but a violation of the sacred trust that bound the tribe's leadership together. What happened next? He asked when Ember paused. He said that as war chief, he had the right to claim any unmarried woman in the tribe as his wife, and that I should be honored by his attention. When I told him I wasn't interested in marriage and wanted to focus on my duties as a scout, he became angry. Ember's voice grew quieter as she described the escalation that had followed. He grabbed my wrist and twisted it until I cried out, then told me that my scouting skills would be meaningless if I couldn't learn to show proper respect to my superiors. He said that if I spoke about our conversation to anyone, he would make sure I was stripped of my scouting privileges and given to one of the older warriors who had been asking about taking young wives. The memory of that first threat was clearly still painful for Ember to recall. Chief Stoneheart's hands clenched into fists as Ember continued her account, describing a pattern of escalating abuse that had been carefully hidden from the rest of the tribe. Warhawk had used his position and knowledge of Ember's schedule to arrange private meetings where he could assault her without witnesses, always with threats about what would happen if she reported his behavior. He knows my patrol routes better than anyone except you, Ember explained. He would appear at remote locations where he knew I would be camping, claiming he was conducting his own security checks. Sometimes he would just threaten me, telling me about all the ways he could destroy my life if I didn't submit to his demands. Other times he would hit me or force himself on me, always making sure the injuries would be hidden by my clothing. Her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting a losing battle for months. The war chief had been particularly cunning in his abuse, targeting areas of Ember's body that would be concealed by her traditional clothing, and timing his attacks to coincide with her solo scouting missions when she would be away from the settlement for days at a time. This allowed her injuries to begin healing before she returned to where other tribe members might notice them. 3 weeks ago, he told me that he had decided to claim me as his wife, whether I agree or not. Ember continued. He said the ceremony would take place after the next full moon, and that if I tried to run away or refuse, he would tell the tribe that I had been meeting secretly with cavalry soldiers and trading information about our defenses for protection. The false accusation would have been devastating to someone whose entire identity was built around loyalty to her people. Chief Stoneheart's expression grew darker with each revelation, but he maintained his composure as Ember described the most recent escalation of Warhawk's campaign of intimidation. 2 nights ago, he came to my lodge after midnight and told me he was tired of waiting for me to accept his proposal. He forced his way inside and attacked me, saying it was time I learned what my role as his wife would entail. Ember's voice broke as she recalled the assault. I fought him off, but he's much stronger than I am. He left these marks, she said, pulling aside her shirt to reveal bruises that were clearly the result of a violent struggle. Before he left, he told me that if I ever fought him again, he would kill me and tell the tribe that I had been murdered by enemy raiders while on patrol. The threat was particularly chilling because Warhawk's position would have made such a cover story completely believable. Chief Stoneheart stood up abruptly, his movement filled with such controlled fury that Ember instinctively flinched. But when he spoke, his voice was gentle despite the rage burning in his eyes. Ember Starwing, you are under my protection now. Warhawk will never touch you again. The promise carried the weight of absolute conviction. He began pacing the length of the council lodge, his mind racing through the implications of what he had learned. Warhawk's betrayal was not just a personal crime, but a threat to the entire structure of tribal leadership and justice. If someone in his position could abuse his authority with impunity, it would undermine the foundation of trust that held their society together. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Chief Stoneheart asked, though his tone carried no accusation. He genuinely needed to understand what had prevented one of his people from seeking help when she needed it most. Ember looked up at him with eyes that held years of pain. Because Warhawk is your war chief, your trusted advisor, your friend. Because he told me that you would never believe the word of a young woman against someone who has served you faithfully for so long. Because he said that even if you did, believe me, you would have to choose between protecting me and maintaining the stability of the tribe, and that you would choose the tribe. Her words revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation that Warhawk had used to maintain his control. The chief stopped pacing and looked directly at Ember. Warhawk was wrong about many things, but he was especially wrong about that. No tribe is stable when its leaders prey upon those they are sworn to protect. No leader is worthy of trust when he abuses his authority to harm the innocent. His voice carried the moral certainty that had guided him through decades of difficult decisions. Chief Stoneheart returned to his seat across from Ember and leaned forward with the intensity of someone making a sacred vow. I need you to understand something that Warhawk clearly doesn't. The strength of our people doesn't come from the power of individual leaders. It comes from our commitment to protecting each other, especially the most vulnerable among us. What he has done to you threatens everything we stand for. His words seemed to lift some of the weight that Ember had been carrying. What happens now? Ember asked, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and fear. She had finally spoken her truth, but the consequences of that truth remained terrifyingly uncertain. Chief Stoneheart's expression became thoughtful as he considered the challenges ahead. Now we gather evidence, build a case that cannot be disputed, and ensure that justice is served in a way that strengthens rather than divides our people. He spoke with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that hasty action could create more problems than it solved. Warhawk has allies in the tribe, Ember pointed out. Warriors who respect him, elders who value his military expertise, families who have benefited from his leadership in battle. If this becomes a matter of my word against his, some people will choose to believe him regardless of the evidence. Her concern was based on a realistic assessment of tribal politics. The chief nodded grimly. Which is why we need more than just your testimony, as compelling and believable as it is. We need to determine whether you are his only victim, and we need to document his pattern of behavior in a way that makes denial impossible. His strategic thinking was already focused on building an unassailable case. Chief Stoneheart stood and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the lodge, from which he withdrew several items: paper made from beaten bark, charcoal for writing, and a small leather pouch containing various herbs. First, we document your injuries and your account of how you received them. Then we begin quietly investigating whether Warhawk has targeted other women in the tribe. His methodical approach reflected years of experience in handling complex tribal disputes. There's something else you should know, Ember said hesitantly. Warhawk made comments that suggested he had done this before. He mentioned other women who had learned to show proper respect for his authority, and he seemed familiar with techniques for concealing evidence of abuse. I don't think I'm his first victim. This revelation added another layer of urgency to the situation. The chief's expression darkened further, but he maintained his controlled demeanor. Then we will find the others, and we will ensure that his pattern of predation ends permanently. The promise carried implications that went far beyond simple punishment. It suggested a fundamental restructuring of how power would be exercised within the tribe. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Whispering Pine settlement, Chief Raphael Stoneheart and Ember Starwing began planning a campaign that would either restore justice to their people or tear their community apart in the attempt. But for the first time in months, Ember felt something she had almost forgotten: hope that her nightmare might finally be coming to an end. 3 days had passed since Ember's revelation in the council lodge, and Chief Raphael Stoneheart found himself walking the narrow mountain path that led to the dwelling of Grandmother Willow, the tribe's eldest medicine woman and keeper of sacred knowledge. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like ghostly fingers, and the sound of his moccasins on the rocky trail seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed forest atmosphere. Grandmother Willow's lodge sat perched on a natural ledge overlooking the entire Whispering Pine settlement, positioned so that she could observe the comings and goings of every tribal member, while remaining removed from the daily politics that sometimes divided the community. At 87, she possessed a wisdom that transcended the normal boundaries of tribal hierarchy, and her counsel was sought by chiefs and commoners alike. Chief Stoneheart found her tending to a collection of medicinal herbs that hung drying from the rafters of her covered porch, her gnarled but steady hands sorting through plants that would be used to heal everything from fever to heartbreak. Her dark eyes, still sharp despite her advanced age, fixed on him with the penetrating gaze that had made generations of tribal members feel as if their deepest secrets were written across their foreheads. You carry the weight of difficult "Knowledge, Raphael Stoneheart," she said without preamble, using his given name in the informal way that was her privilege as an elder. "The spirits have been whispering of shadows within our own lodge fires, of trust broken by those who should be its guardians." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had seen too much of human nature to be surprised by its darker manifestations. Chief Stoneheart settled onto the wooden stool that Grandmother Willow indicated, accepting the cup of bitter pine needle tea that she prepared with movements that spoke of decades of practice. "You know why I've come," he said, recognizing that attempting to hide anything from the medicine woman would be both futile and disrespectful. "The young scout who moves like a wounded deer when she thinks no one is watching, Grandmother," Willow replied, her tone carrying both sadness and anger. "The war chief who has forgotten that strength without honor is merely brutality wearing a mask of authority." She continued sorting herbs as she spoke, but Chief Stoneheart could see the tension in her shoulders that indicated her deep concern about the situation. The chief leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, despite their isolation. "How long have you known?" The question carried implications that went far beyond simple curiosity. It suggested that the abuse might have been more visible to observant eyes than either he or Ember had realized. Grandmother Willow set down her herbs and fixed Chief Stoneheart with a stare that seemed to penetrate straight through to his soul. "I have suspected for many seasons, but suspicion and knowledge are different things. The girl has been coming to me for herbs to ease pain and promote healing, always with explanations about training accidents or falls during her scouting missions." Her words carried the frustration of someone who had wanted to help but had been constrained by the victim's need for secrecy. "Why didn't you come to me with your suspicions?" Chief Stoneheart asked, though his tone carried no accusation. He genuinely needed to understand what had prevented the tribal support system from functioning as it should have. The medicine woman's expression grew stern, and Chief Stoneheart was reminded that despite her age, Grandmother Willow possessed a formidable intelligence that had guided the tribe through countless crises. Because suspicions without proof can destroy innocent lives, and because young women who are being hurt often retreat further into silence when they feel their privacy has been violated by well-meaning elders. Her response revealed a sophisticated understanding of the psychology of abuse. Grandmother Willow rose from her seat and disappeared into the interior of her lodge, returning moments later with a collection of bark scrolls that she spread across the wooden table between them. The scrolls contained her meticulous records of every healing request she had received over the past year, organized by date and by the nature of the ailment being treated. "Look at this pattern," she said, pointing to entries marked with a by distinctive symbol that Chief Stoneheart recognized as representing Ember's visits. "She first came to me 6 moons ago, requesting herbs for bruised ribs that she claimed resulted from a fall while climbing to observe enemy positions. The injuries were consistent with her explanation, so I treated them without question." Her finger traced the chronological progression of visits, but then the requests became more frequent, and the explanations began to follow a pattern that troubled me, Grandmother Willow continued. "Always training accidents, always occurring. During solo missions where there were no witnesses, always involving injuries that would be concealed by her normal clothing." The documented evidence painted a clear picture of systematic abuse disguised as routine hazards of scouting work. Chief Stoneheart studied the records with growing horror, realizing that Ember's suffering had been far more extensive than even her detailed confession had revealed. "How many times did she come to you?" he asked, though he was beginning to suspect that the answer would be more disturbing than he was prepared to hear. 14 times in 6 moons, Grandmother Willow replied grimly. Each time requesting stronger herbs for pain, each time with new injuries that followed the same pattern of deliberate concealment. The girl became skilled at explaining away evidence of violence, but bodies tell their own stories to those who know how to read them. Her expertise as a healer had given her insights that others might have missed. The medicine woman pointed to specific entries in her records that detailed the progression of Ember's injuries over time. The early visits were for bruises and minor cuts that could plausibly have resulted from accidents. But as the moons passed, the injuries became more severe: cracked ribs, damaged kidneys, trauma that spoke of deliberate and sustained violence rather than mishaps during scouting duties. The clinical documentation was more damning than any emotional testimony could have been. Chief Stoneheart felt a cold rage building in his chest as he comprehended the full scope of what Warhawk had been doing under his nose. Did she ever directly admit what was happening? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Never, Grandmother Willow confirmed. But during her last visit, 3 suns ago, she asked me whether I knew of herbs that could prevent conception. When I asked why she needed such knowledge, she became evasive and claimed she was asking for a friend who was considering marriage. The implication of that request was clear and horrifying. Chief Stoneheart spent the remainder of the morning reviewing Grandmother Willow's records, looking for patterns that might indicate other women in the tribe had been subjected to similar abuse. What he discovered was a troubling increase in visits from young women requesting treatment for injuries that followed suspicious patterns. Here, Grandmother Willow said, pointing to entries from the previous year. Singing Bird, the blacksmith's daughter, came to me 7 times over 4 moons with injuries she attributed to clumsiness while helping her father with his work. But the nature of the wounds suggested they were inflicted by someone much larger and stronger than herself. The records painted a picture of another young woman struggling with unexplained trauma. The medicine woman's finger moved to another section of her scrolls. And Dancing Fox, who works in the communal kitchens, requested herbs for nightmares and sleeplessness that began suddenly after she was assigned to prepare meals for the War Council meetings. She claimed the responsibility was causing her anxiety, but her symptoms were consistent with those I have seen in women who have experienced violent trauma. The clinical observations were building a case that went far beyond Ember's individual situation. Chief Stoneheart's hands clenched into fists as he absorbed the implications of what Grandmother Willow was showing him. You believe Warhawk has been systematically targeting multiple women in our tribe? The question was more of a statement, as the evidence was becoming overwhelming. I believe, Grandmother Willow said carefully, that we have a pattern of young women suffering from injuries and trauma that cannot be adequately explained by their daily activities, and that these incidents have increased significantly since Warhawk's influence within the tribe has grown. Her measured response reflected both her certainty about the evidence and her caution about making accusations that could not be definitively proven. The chief stood and began pacing the length of the medicine woman's porch, his mind racing through the implications of what he was learning. If Warhawk had indeed been preying upon multiple women, it represented not just individual crimes, but a systematic corruption of the tribal power structure that threatened the very foundation of their society. We need to speak with these women, Chief Stoneheart said, his voice carrying the determination of a leader who had made a difficult decision. But we must approach them carefully, in a way that respects their autonomy and doesn't force them to relive trauma they may not be ready to confront. His consideration for the potential victims reflected both his wisdom as a leader and his growing understanding of the psychology of abuse. That afternoon, Chief Stoneheart and Grandmother Willow approached Singing Bird at her father's forge, timing their visit to coincide with the blacksmith's absence on a trading mission to a neighboring settlement. The young woman, barely 21, was working alone at the anvil, her movements displaying the skill and strength that had made her an invaluable assistant to her father's craft. Singing Bird looked up nervously as the chief and medicine woman approached, her eyes darting between them with the wariness of someone who had learned to expect trouble from unexpected visits by authority figures. Her hands unconsciously smoothed down her leather apron, a gesture that Grandmother Willow recognized as an attempt to conceal something beneath the protective clothing. Singing Bird, Chief Stoneheart said gently. "We would like to speak with you about a matter of great importance to the tribe. Would you be willing to join us in private conversation?" His tone was carefully modulated to be reassuring rather than commanding, recognizing that the young woman's cooperation would be essential to their investigation. The blacksmith's daughter set down her hammer and wiped her hands on her apron, her movements betraying the nervousness that her expression tried to hide. "Of course, Chief Stoneheart. Have I done something wrong?" The question carried an undertone of genuine fear that suggested she had reason to expect accusations rather than requests for assistance. Grandmother Willow stepped forward with the maternal authority that had comforted generations of tribal members. "You have done nothing wrong, child. We are investigating a situation that may have affected several young women in our tribe, and we believe your perspective could be valuable in helping us understand what has been happening." Her explanation was designed to position Singing Bird as a helpful witness rather than a victim under scrutiny. They moved to a quiet grove of aspen trees behind the forge, where the sound of running water from a nearby stream would mask their conversation from any potential eavesdroppers. Chief Stoneheart noticed that Singing Bird chose to sit with her back against a large boulder, positioning herself so that she could see anyone approaching from any direction. "Singing Bird," Grandmother Willow began, "I have been reviewing my healing records, and I noticed that you visited me several times last year requesting treatment for injuries. I want you to know that anything you tell us will be held in complete confidence, and that you are under no obligation to share more than you feel comfortable revealing." Her approach was designed to give the young woman maximum control over the conversation. Singing Bird's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced nervously toward the settlement as if checking to ensure they were truly alone. "I remember those visits," she said carefully. "I was having problems with clumsiness, falling and injuring myself while working at the forge." Her explanation sounded rehearsed, as if she had repeated it many times. Chief Stoneheart leaned forward slightly, his expression combining authority with compassion. "Singing Bird, we have reason to believe that some of the women in our tribe have been hurt by someone who should have been protecting them. If you have knowledge of such a situation, sharing that information could help us prevent other women from being harmed." His words were chosen to emphasize her potential role as a protector rather than simply a victim. For several long moments, Singing Bird stared at the ground, her internal struggle clearly visible in the tension of her posture and the rapid rise and fall of her breathing. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with tears that she had apparently been holding back for months. "It was Warhawk," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the stream. "He told me that if I ever spoke about what happened, he would convince my father that I had been meeting secretly with men from other tribes, and that my father would be forced to disown me to preserve his reputation as a craftsman." The confession emerged like water breaking through a dam. Chief Stoneheart felt his anger toward Warhawk deepen as he listened to Singing Bird describe a pattern of abuse that was disturbingly similar to what Ember had endured. The war chief had approached her under the pretense of commissioning special weapons for his personal use, then gradually escalated to inappropriate comments, unwanted touching, and eventually violent assault. He said that as war chief, he had the right to inspect any weapons being made for tribal use, and that this gave him authority to visit the forge whenever he chose. Singing Bird continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared her story. "At first, the visit seemed legitimate, but then he began making comments about my appearance, asking personal questions about my relationships with young men in the tribe. The progression from professional interaction to personal intrusion followed a familiar pattern, Grandmother." Willow listened with the patient attention of someone who had heard too many similar stories over her long lifetime. "When did his behavior become physically threatening?" she asked, her clinical approach helping Singing Bird maintain her composure while discussing traumatic memories. "The first time he touched me inappropriately was during the harvest festival last year," Singing Bird replied. He cornered me behind the food preparation area and put his hands on my body, saying that he wanted to inspect the quality of the metalwork on my ceremonial jewelry. The memory clearly caused her significant distress, but she continued with remarkable courage. The young woman went on to describe a pattern of escalating abuse that had continued for months, with Warhawk using his authority and knowledge of her family's economic dependence on tribal commissions to maintain control over her. He told me that if I caused trouble, he could convince the council that my father's weapons were inferior and that the tribe should find a new blacksmith. She explained. Chief Stoneheart realized that Warhawk's abuse had been far more sophisticated than simple physical violence. He had weaponized the entire structure of tribal society to maintain control over his victims. Did he threaten you in other ways? The chief asked, though he suspected the answer would reveal additional layers of manipulation. He said that he had influence with warriors from other tribes, and that if I ever left Whispering Pines, he could spread word that I was a woman of loose morals who could not be trusted. Singing Bird replied. He made it clear that he had the power to destroy my reputation and my family's livelihood, whether I stayed or tried to leave. The comprehensive nature of his threats had effectively trapped her in an impossible situation. As the afternoon wore on, Chief Stoneheart and Grandmother Willow gathered detailed testimony from Singing Bird, documenting not just the physical abuse she had endured, but also the sophisticated system of psychological manipulation that Warhawk had used to maintain control. The picture that emerged was of a predator who had carefully studied the vulnerabilities of tribal society and exploited them with ruthless efficiency. "There's something else you should know," Singing Bird said as their conversation neared its end. Warhawk made comments that suggested I wasn't the only woman he was controlling. He mentioned other young women by name, talking about how they had learned to show proper respect for his authority. Her revelation confirmed Chief Stoneheart's growing suspicion that they were dealing with a systematic pattern of abuse. The chief exchanged glances with Grandmother Willow, both recognizing the implications of what they were hearing. "Can you remember the names he mentioned?" he asked, though he was careful to frame the question as a request rather than a demand. Singing Bird nodded reluctantly. He talked about Ember Starwing frequently, saying that she needed to learn her place within the tribal hierarchy. He also mentioned Dancing Fox and Mourning Dove, always in the context of women who had benefited from his guidance and protection. The names she provided matched some of the suspicious patterns Grandmother Willow had identified in her healing records. Chief Stoneheart felt a cold certainty settling in his stomach as he realized the full scope of what Warhawk had been doing. "Singing Bird, what you have told us takes tremendous courage, and it may be the key to preventing other women from suffering as you have," he said, his voice carrying both gratitude and determination. The young woman looked directly at him. For the first time during their conversation, "What will happen to Warhawk?" she asked, her tone mixing hope with fear about the potential consequences of her testimony. "Justice will be served," Chief Stoneheart replied, his words carrying the weight of a sacred oath. "But first, we must ensure that we have enough evidence to make our case unassailable, and we must protect all the women who have been harmed while we build that case." His response reflected both his commitment to justice and his understanding of the political challenges they would face. As the sun began to set over the Whispering Pines settlement, Chief Stoneheart realized that they were no longer dealing with an isolated incident of abuse, but with a criminal conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of their society. Warhawk's systematic exploitation of his position had corrupted the trust that held their community together, and restoring that trust would require more than simple punishment. It would require a fundamental restructuring of how power was exercised and monitored within their tribe. That evening, Chief Stoneheart met privately with Grandmother Willow in her lodge to plan their next steps. The evidence they had gathered was compelling, but they both understood that confronting Warhawk prematurely could result in retaliation against his victims, and the destruction of crucial evidence. We need to approach Dancing Fox in mourning. Dove, Chief Stoneheart said, referring to the other women Singing Bird had mentioned. If they confirm similar patterns of abuse, we will have testimony from multiple victims that establishes Warhawk's criminal behavior beyond any reasonable doubt. His strategic thinking reflected years of experience in building consensus within the tribal council. Grandmother Willow nodded, her agreement while preparing a mixture of herbs that would help calm their nerves during the difficult conversations ahead. We must also consider the possibility that there are other victims who have not yet been identified, she pointed out. Warhawk's pattern of behavior suggests someone who has been refining his techniques over time, which implies a longer history of predation than we have yet uncovered. Her clinical analysis was both valuable and disturbing. The chief stood and moved to the window of the lodge, looking out over the settlement where families were gathering around their evening fires, unaware of the darkness that had been festering in their midst. How do we proceed without alerting Warhawk to our investigation? He asked, recognizing that the war chief's position gave him access to information about many tribal activities. Carefully and quietly, Grandmother Willow replied. We approach each potential witness individually in settings where their conversations with us will appear routine rather than investigative. We gather their testimony while maintaining the appearance of normal tribal business. Her suggestion reflected a sophisticated understanding of the need for discretion in sensitive investigations. Chief Stoneheart turned back toward the medicine woman, his expression grave with the weight of leadership in crisis. And what do we do about Warhawk's continued access to potential victims while we build our case? The question highlighted one of the most difficult aspects of their situation, the need to protect women who might be at risk while avoiding actions that could compromise their investigation. We increase our vigilance without appearing to do so, Grandmother Willow suggested. We create opportunities for the women to have support and witnesses available, and we monitor Warhawk's movements as closely as possible without arousing his suspicion. Her approach balanced the need for protection with the requirements of building a solid case. As the two tribal leaders planned their strategy for exposing Warhawk's crimes, both understood that they were embarking on a course of action that would either restore justice to their community or tear it apart in the attempt. But the alternative, allowing the abuse to continue, was unthinkable for people who had dedicated their lives to protecting and serving their people. The full moon hung like a silver shield above the Whispering Pine settlement, casting long shadows across the canyon floor as Chief Raphael Stoneheart made his way through the darkness toward the sacred cave where the tribe's most important ceremonies were conducted. He carried with him a leather satchel containing testimony from 4 women, healing records that documented systematic abuse, and a plan that would either restore justice to his people or destroy the fragile unity that had sustained them through countless hardships. 2 weeks had passed since his investigation began, and the evidence against Warhawk had grown from disturbing suspicions to an overwhelming case of criminal predation. Dancing Fox had confirmed Singing Bird's testimony, revealing a pattern of abuse that had begun shortly after her assignment to prepare meals for the War Council. Mourning Dove, the tribe's most skilled weaver, had reluctantly admitted to months of harassment that escalated whenever she was working alone in the textile lodge, but tonight was different. Tonight, Chief Stoneheart would implement a strategy that Grandmother Willow had suggested, a plan that would force Warhawk to reveal his true nature in front of witnesses who could not be intimidated or silenced. The sacred cave provided the perfect setting for what they had planned, a place where the ancient laws of the tribe demanded absolute honesty, and where violations of sacred trust carried consequences that even Warhawk's political influence could not overturn. The chief paused at the entrance to the cave, where glowing embers from the ceremonial fire cast dancing patterns on the stone walls, carved with generations of tribal history. Inside, he could see the silhouettes of the 5 council elders who had agreed to participate in tonight's proceedings. their faces grave with the knowledge of what they were about to witness. Each elder had been carefully chosen for their integrity and their inability to be swayed by political considerations. Standing Bear, the eldest of the council members at 73, had served as a keeper of tribal law for over 4 decades and commanded respect from every member of the Whispering Pines band. His presence alone would lend weight to whatever testimony was presented, and his reputation for fairness would make it difficult for anyone to question the legitimacy of the proceedings. Beside him sat Gray Eagle, the tribe's master storyteller and guardian of oral tradition, whose role required him to remember and accurately transmit the most important events in tribal history. His participation ensured that whatever happened tonight would be preserved in the collective memory of the people, making it impossible for future revisionist accounts to distort the truth. Thundercloud, the spiritual leader responsible for maintaining the tribe's connection to the sacred world, represented the moral authority that governed behavior within the community. His involvement signaled that tonight's proceedings involved not just legal violations but fundamental questions about the spiritual health of the tribe. Swift River, the master hunter whose skills had kept the tribe fed through difficult winters, brought the perspective of someone who understood survival and the importance of trust in life or death situations. His practical wisdom would be crucial in helping the council understand the real-world implications of War Hawk's betrayal. Finally, Wise Owl, the only female elder on the council, served as the voice of the women whose perspectives had too often been overlooked in tribal decision-making. Her presence represented a deliberate shift toward including feminine wisdom in the justice process, acknowledging that crimes against women required input from those who understood their unique vulnerabilities and strengths. Chief Stoneheart entered the cave and took his place in the circle of elders, setting down his leather satchel with movements that conveyed both reverence for the sacred space and determination to see justice done. The ceremonial fire crackled between them, sending sparks spiraling upward through the natural chimney that carried smoke to the star-filled sky above. "Brothers and sister," he began, using the formal address reserved for the most solemn tribal gatherings, "I have called you here tonight to witness testimony that will challenge everything we thought we knew about honor and leadership within our community." His words carried the weight of someone who understood that what they were about to hear would fundamentally change their tribe. Standing Bear leaned forward, his weathered face reflecting decades of experience in dealing with difficult tribal disputes. "Raphael Stoneheart, we have answered your call because we trust your judgment and respect your leadership," he said, his voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom. "But we must understand the gravity of what you are asking us to witness before we can proceed with clear consciences." Chief Stoneheart opened his satchel and withdrew the carefully organized testimonies that he and Grandmother Willow had collected over the past 2 weeks. "What I am about to share with you represents the systematic abuse of power by someone we have all trusted with the safety and welfare of our people," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. Gray Eagle shifted uncomfortably, his storyteller's instincts already anticipating the dark narrative that was about to unfold. "You speak of someone within our own leadership," he observed, his tone suggesting that he had already begun to suspect the identity of the accused. "This is not a matter we can address lightly, regardless of the evidence presented." Thunder Cloud raised his hand in the gesture that requested permission to speak, his role as spiritual leader giving him special authority in matters involving moral violations. "Before we proceed, we must acknowledge that what we learn tonight may require us to take actions that will affect the entire tribe," he said, his words carrying the gravity of someone who understood the spiritual implications of their gathering. Wise Owl's eyes fixed on Chief Stoneheart with the penetrating gaze that had made her one of the most respected advisors in the tribe's history. "If we are to judge the actions of a leader who has betrayed the trust placed in him, we must ensure that our own judgment is beyond reproach," she said, her feminine perspective adding a crucial dimension to their deliberations. Swift River nodded his agreement with the other elders before addressing Chief Stoneheart directly. "Tell us what you have discovered, and let the truth speak for itself," he said, his practical nature cutting through the ceremonial formalities to focus on the essential facts they needed to hear. Chief Stoneheart began with Ember's story, reading her testimony aloud in the flickering firelight, while the elders listened with expressions that grew increasingly grim as the full scope of Lakota Warhawk's crimes became clear. He described the systematic intimidation, the threats against her immigration status, the escalating physical violence, and the sophisticated psychological manipulation that had kept her silent for months. The pattern of abuse documented here represents not just individual crimes against one woman, but a fundamental corruption of the authority we have entrusted to our war chief. Chief Stoneheart explained as he finished reading Ember's account. But her testimony is only the beginning of what we have discovered. Standing Bear's hands clenched into fists as he absorbed the implications of what he was hearing. "You are telling us that Warhawk has been using his position to prey upon the women of our tribe," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. "These are accusations that strike at the very heart of what it means to be a leader among our people." Chief Stoneheart nodded gravely before continuing with Singing Bird's testimony, describing how Warhawk had exploited her family's economic dependence on tribal commissions to maintain control over her. The elders listened in stunned silence as the pattern of predation became clear, each revelation adding another layer to their understanding of how thoroughly their trust had been betrayed. Grey Eagle interrupted the reading to ask a question that had been troubling him. "How long has this been happening without our knowledge?" he asked, his role as keeper of tribal history making him acutely aware of the implications for their community's legacy. If Warhawk has been systematically abusing his authority for months or years, what does that say about our ability to protect our own people? The question hung in the air like smoke from the ceremonial fire, forcing each elder to confront their own role in failing to detect the predation that had been occurring under their collective leadership. Thundercloud was the first to respond, his spiritual perspective providing a framework for understanding their collective failure. "Sometimes the greatest evil wears the mask of righteousness," Thundercloud said, his voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. "Warhawk's reputation as a fierce defender of our people may have blinded us to his true nature, just as it was intended to do. The spirits teach us that wolves often hunt most successfully when they are accepted as part of the pack." Wise Owl leaned forward, her feminine intuition providing insights that her male colleagues might have missed. "There is another question we must consider," she said, her voice cutting through the philosophical discussions to focus on practical concerns. "If Warhawk has been this successful in concealing his crimes from us, how do we know we have identified all of his victims? There may be women who are still too frightened to come forward, even with our investigation." Chief Stoneheart acknowledged the validity of Wise Owl's concern before revealing the strategy that he and Grandmother Willow had developed to address exactly that problem. "We have devised a plan that will not only confirm Warhawk's guilt beyond any doubt, but will also create an opportunity for any remaining victims to come forward safely," he explained. The chief described how they intended to use the upcoming Harvest Moon ceremony as cover for their operation. Warhawk would be invited to participate in a special ritual that supposedly honored the contributions of the tribe's military leadership, but the ceremony would actually be designed to expose his predatory behavior in front of the entire community. Ember has agreed to participate in this plan, despite the personal risk it represents, Chief Stoneheart continued. "She will approach Warhawk during the ceremony and engage him in conversation that we hope will trigger his predatory instincts. Hidden witnesses will document his behavior, providing evidence that cannot be disputed or dismissed." Swift River immediately grasped the tactical implications of the plan. "You are using our scout as bait to trap a predator," he said, his hunter's instincts recognizing both the elegance and the danger of the strategy. "But what protections do you have in place if Warhawk becomes violent or suspicious?" Chief Stoneheart had anticipated this concern and outlined the extensive precautions they had planned. Warriors loyal to him would be positioned throughout the ceremony area, ready to intervene instantly if Ember was threatened. Grandmother Willow would be monitoring from a concealed position, with clear lines of sight to the entire interaction. "More importantly," Chief Stoneheart added, "we have arranged for the conversation to take place in the sacred circle, where tribal law requires absolute honesty. If Warhawk reveals his true nature in that setting, even his most loyal supporters will be forced to acknowledge what he has become." Standing Bear stroked his gray beard thoughtfully as he considered the implications of the proposed plan. "This strategy relies heavily on Warhawk behaving according to his established pattern," he observed. "But predators can be cunning when they sense danger. What if he recognizes the trap and refuses to reveal himself?" Gray Eagle nodded in agreement with Standing Bear's concern. "And what if the exposure of his crimes creates a division within the tribe that we cannot heal?" He added, his understanding of social dynamics making him aware of the political risks they were taking. Warhawk has supporters who may refuse to believe the evidence, regardless of how compelling it might be. Thundercloud stood and moved closer to the ceremonial fire, his silhouette commanding attention as he prepared to address the fundamental moral questions raised by their discussion. "My brothers and sister," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who spoke for the spiritual welfare of the community, "we are debating the mechanics of justice, but we must not lose sight of the moral imperative that guides our actions." The spiritual leader's words seemed to focus the attention of the other elders, reminding them that their decisions would affect not just the immediate participants, but the long-term spiritual health of their entire community. "The spirits have shown us that evil flourishes when good people choose silence over action." Thunder Cloud continued. "Warhawk's crimes represent a violation of the sacred trust that binds our people together." Wise Owl rose to stand beside Thundercloud, her presence adding the feminine perspective that was crucial to their deliberations. "The women of our tribe have suffered in silence because they believed no one would listen to their testimony against a respected leader," she said, her voice carrying both sadness and determination. "If we fail to act now, we send a message that power protects predators and that victims have no recourse against those who abuse authority." Her words seemed to crystallize the moral stakes involved in their decision, forcing each elder to confront the broader implications of either action or inaction. Standing Bear was the first to respond, his long experience in tribal governance providing a framework for understanding their responsibilities. "Wise Owl speaks truth that cuts through all our tactical concerns," Standing Bear said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent wrestling with difficult decisions. "The question is not whether Warhawk's crimes deserve punishment. The evidence clearly demonstrates that they do. The question is whether we have the courage to pursue justice, even when it threatens our community's stability." Swift River nodded his agreement, his practical nature cutting through the philosophical discussions to focus on immediate realities. "And whether we can design our pursuit of justice in a way that strengthens, rather than weakens our tribe's ability to survive the challenges ahead," he added, his hunter's perspective emphasizing the importance of thinking strategically about long-term consequences. Gray Eagle leaned back against the cave wall, his storyteller's imagination already envisioning how future generations would remember this moment. "The story we create tonight will be told around tribal fires for generations," he said, his words carrying the weight of someone who understood the power of narrative to shape cultural memory. "We must ensure that it is a story of courage and justice rather than cowardice and complicity." As the fire burned lower and the night deepened around them, the 5 elders engaged in a discussion that would determine not just Warhawk's fate, but the moral direction of their entire community. Each perspective was carefully considered, each concern thoroughly explored, until a consensus began to emerge from their collective wisdom. I believe we must proceed with Chief Stoneheart's plan. Standing Bear declared, his voice carrying the authority of his age and experience. The evidence of Warhawk's crimes is overwhelming, and our obligation to protect the women of our tribe outweighs any concerns about political stability. Thundercloud nodded his agreement, adding the spiritual dimension that gave their decision moral weight. The spirits have guided us to this knowledge for a purpose, he said, his words carrying the conviction of someone who saw divine intervention in their discovery of Warhawk's crimes. To ignore their guidance would be to invite even greater corruption into our community. Wise Owl's agreement was particularly significant, given her unique perspective as the only female elder, and her special understanding of the challenges faced by Warhawk's victims. The women who have suffered in silence deserve to see justice done, she said, her voice carrying both compassion and determination. And the women who might become future victims deserve our protection. Swift River and Gray Eagle added their voices to the growing consensus, each contributing their unique perspectives to the collective decision. We proceed carefully but decisively, Swift River said, his tactical thinking focused on execution rather than further deliberation. We protect Ember while she helps us expose the truth, and we prepare for whatever consequences follow, Gray Eagle's contribution focused on the narrative implications of their decision. We ensure that the story told by our actions is one that honors our ancestors and provides guidance for our descendants, he said, his understanding of cultural continuity emphasizing the importance of making decisions that would stand the test of time. Chief Stoneheart felt a weight lift from his shoulders as the elders reached their unanimous decision to proceed with the plan. Then we move forward with the Harvest Moon ceremony, he said, his voice carrying both relief and determination. Warhawk will face justice, and our people will see that predators cannot hide behind positions of authority. Over the following days, Chief Stoneheart and the elders worked with meticulous care to prepare for the ceremony that would either vindicate their faith in justice or expose the limitations of their power to protect the innocent. Every detail was planned with the precision of a military operation, but disguised as routine preparation for one of the tribe's most important annual celebrations. Ember underwent intensive preparation with Grandmother Willow, learning techniques for remaining calm under pressure and strategies for encouraging Warhawk to reveal his predatory nature without putting herself in excessive danger. The medicine woman's wisdom proved invaluable in helping the young scout prepare psychologically for what would be an extremely challenging performance. Remember, Grandmother Willow counseled during one of their training sessions, you are not just seeking justice for yourself, but for all the women who have suffered and all those who might suffer in the future. That knowledge will give you strength when fear threatens to overwhelm you. The positioning of witnesses was carefully planned to ensure that Warhawk's behavior would be observed and documented from multiple angles while maintaining the appearance of a normal ceremonial gathering. Warriors loyal to Chief Stoneheart were assigned duties that would place them in strategic locations without arousing suspicion. As the night of the Harvest Moon ceremony approached, the entire Whispering Pines settlement buzzed with anticipation for what was traditionally one of their most joyous annual celebrations. But for those who knew what was really planned, the approaching ceremony carried a tension that had nothing to do with harvest festivities and everything to do with the pursuit of long-delayed justice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either restore moral order to their community or tear it apart in the attempt. But Chief Stoneheart and his allies had committed themselves to the belief that truth and justice were worth any risk, and that the courage to act in defense of the innocent was what separated civilization from barbarism. The Harvest Moon rose like a copper shield above the Sierra Nevada peaks, casting an ethereal glow across the Whispering Pines. settlement as hundreds of tribal members gathered in the ceremonial circle for their most sacred annual celebration. The air thrummed with the deep resonance of ceremonial drums, while dancers moved in ancient patterns around fires that had been burning since sunset, their shadows weaving stories of gratitude and renewal against the canyon walls. Chief Raphael Stoneheart stood at the edge of the sacred circle, his ceremonial regalia glinting in the firelight as he surveyed the gathering with eyes that saw far more than the joyous celebration apparent to casual observers. Hidden among the dancers and spectators were his carefully positioned allies, each playing their assigned role in the trap that would either expose Warhawk's crimes or demonstrate the limitations of justice in a community where power and tradition intersected in complex ways. Ember Starwing moved through the crowd with the fluid grace that had made her such an effective scout, but tonight her skills were focused on a different kind of mission. She wore traditional ceremonial dress that emphasized her status as an honored member of the tribe, but beneath the beautifully beaded doeskin, her heart hammered with the knowledge that the next few hours would determine not just her own fate, but the moral direction of her entire community. Warhawk dominated the area near the main ceremonial fire, his imposing figure commanding attention as he regaled a circle of younger warriors with tales of his military exploits. At 41, he remained physically formidable, his scarred hands and weathered features speaking to decades of combat experience that had earned him the respect and fear of both allies and enemies. Tonight, he wore the ceremonial war paint that marked him as the tribe's military leader, unaware that he was about to become the central figure in a very different kind of battle. Grandmother Willow occupied a position of honor among the elder women, her sharp eyes constantly monitoring the interactions around the ceremonial fires, while maintaining the appearance of someone simply enjoying the traditional festivities. Her medical bag contained not just the usual herbs and remedies, but also materials for documenting whatever evidence they managed to gather during the evening's events. The 5 council elders who had heard the testimony in the sacred cave were distributed throughout the gathering, each maintaining careful watch over different aspects of the ceremony, while appearing to participate normally in the traditional celebrations. Their presence added weight to whatever would unfold, ensuring that any evidence gathered would be witnessed by the highest authorities in tribal governance. The ceremony began with the traditional offerings to the spirits of the harvest as tribal members approached the sacred fires with bundles of corn, squash, and wild game that represented the bounty they had gathered during the season of growth. Chief Stoneheart participated in these rituals with the reverence they deserved, but his attention remained focused on the careful choreography that would soon bring Ember into contact with Warhawk. Singing Bird moved through the crowd carrying a ceremonial basket filled with corn that she had grown in her family's garden, her presence serving multiple purposes in the evening's plan. As one of Warhawk's documented victims, her reactions to his behavior would provide additional evidence of his predatory nature, while her courage in participating despite her trauma demonstrated the strength that his abuse had failed to break. Dancing Fox performed her traditional role in the harvest ceremony, leading a group of women in the ancient corn grinding ritual that symbolized the transformation of raw grain into sustenance for the community. Her participation required her to move throughout the ceremonial area, providing natural opportunities to observe and potentially intervene if the planned confrontation took an unexpected turn. Mourning Dove worked at her ceremonial loom, weaving patterns that told the story of the harvest season while maintaining a position that allowed her to monitor Warhawk's interactions with other tribal members. Her artistic skills had been weaponized for the evening, as she created what appeared to be traditional ceremonial art, but actually served as a form of documentation of the night's events. The drummers maintained the rhythmic heartbeat that drove the ceremony forward, their ancient patterns providing both spiritual energy and practical cover for the subtle movements of Chief Stoneheart's allies as they took their assigned positions throughout the gathering. The music seemed to intensify as the moon reached its zenith, as if the spirits themselves were preparing for the revelation that was about to unfold. Swift River led a group of hunters in the traditional meat distribution ceremony, moving through the crowd with portions of venison and elk that would be shared among all tribal members according to ancient custom. His route had been carefully planned to bring him near the area where the confrontation was expected to occur, positioning him to intervene quickly if Warhawk's behavior escalated to violence. As the ceremony reached its traditional midpoint, Ember began her carefully rehearsed approach toward Warhawk's position near the main fire. She moved with apparent casualness, stopping to speak with various tribal members and participate in traditional activities that gradually brought her closer to her target without arousing suspicion. Warhawk noticed her approach with the predatory awareness that had made him such an effective hunter of both animals and human prey. His eyes tracked her movement through the crowd, and observers who knew what to look for could see the subtle shift in his posture that indicated his interest had been aroused. "Warhawk," Ember said as she approached his circle, her voice carrying the respectful tone appropriate for addressing a senior military leader during a sacred ceremony. "I wanted to thank you for your guidance during my recent scouting missions. Your strategic wisdom has helped me become a more effective servant of our people." The war chief's response was immediate and revealing, his expression shifting from public ceremoniousness to the intimate possessiveness that characterized his interactions with his victims. "Ember Starwing," he replied, his voice carrying undertones that would have been invisible to casual observers, but were clearly audible to the hidden witnesses. "Your dedication to improvement is admirable. Perhaps we should discuss your progress more privately." Chief Stoneheart, positioned where he could observe the interaction without being obvious, felt his jaw tighten as he watched Warhawk's body language shift into the predatory pattern that his victims had described. The war chief moved closer to Ember, invading her personal space in a way that spoke of assumed ownership rather than professional mentorship. Standing bare, observing from his position among the elders, recognized the significance of what he was witnessing. Warhawk's behavior toward Ember was markedly different from his interactions with other tribal members, displaying a familiarity and possessiveness that had no place in a public ceremonial setting. Gray Eagle positioned himself where he could hear the conversation clearly, his storyteller's training giving him the ability to memorize dialogue with perfect accuracy. The words he was hearing would become part of the official record of the evening's events, preserved in the oral tradition that served as the tribe's collective memory. Thundercloud observed the interaction from a spiritual perspective, recognizing the violation of sacred space that Warhawk's predatory behavior represented. The ceremonial circle was intended to be a place of safety and spiritual communion, and Warhawk's corruption of that sacred environment added a religious dimension to his crimes. Ember continued her performance with remarkable courage, drawing Warhawk deeper into conversation while maintaining the appearance of innocent respect for his authority. "I have been thinking about what you said regarding my need for guidance and protection," she said, her words carefully chosen to trigger his possessive instincts while providing clear evidence of his inappropriate behavior. Warhawk's response exceeded even the worst expectations of those who were monitoring the interaction. "Yes," he said, moving closer and placing his hand on her arm in a gesture that was clearly possessive rather than ceremonial. "A young woman in your position needs strong protection, and I have been considering how best to provide that security." The way he emphasized the word "considering" carried implications that made several of the hidden observers exchange meaningful glances. Warhawk was revealing exactly the kind of proprietary attitude toward Ember that his victims had described in their testimony. Wise Owl, watching from her position among the women's ceremonial activities, felt anger rising in her chest as she witnessed Warhawk's behavior firsthand. The casual way he touched Ember, the possessive tone in his voice, the assumption of authority over her personal life, all of it confirmed the systematic abuse that had been described in the sacred cave. "I am grateful for your concern," Ember replied, her voice steady despite the revulsion she felt at Warhawk's touch. "But I wonder about the other women in our tribe who might also benefit from such protection. Surely your wisdom should be shared more broadly." The question was designed to prompt Warhawk to reveal his pattern of targeting multiple victims, and his response was even more incriminating than Chief Stoneheart had dared to hope. "Some women require more individual attention than others," Warhawk said, his voice dropping to a tone that was intended to be seductive, but came across as menacing to the trained observers. "Women like you, and Singing Bird, and Dancing Fox women who understand the value of strong male guidance," Swift River, positioned within hearing range of the conversation, felt his hunter's instincts respond to the predatory undertones. In Warhawk's voice, the war chief was essentially confessing to his pattern of targeting specific women, revealing knowledge of their vulnerabilities that went far beyond normal military leadership responsibilities. Grandmother Willow moved closer to the interaction while maintaining her cover as a medicine woman tending to ceremonial duties. Her trained ear caught nuances in Warhawk's speech that confirmed her medical observations about the trauma his victims had experienced. As the conversation continued, Warhawk's behavior became increasingly brazen, apparently emboldened by what he interpreted as Ember's receptiveness to his advances. He began describing his expectations for her future conduct with a specificity that left no doubt about his predatory intentions. "A scout of your caliber deserves special recognition," he continued, his hand now resting possessively on her shoulder. "I have been planning a ceremony to honor your contributions, one that would establish a more permanent relationship between us. Of course, such recognition comes with certain responsibilities and expectations." The euphemistic language barely concealed threats that would have been familiar to anyone who had studied the pattern of abuse documented in Chief Stoneheart's investigation. Warhawk was essentially demanding sexual submission in exchange for continued employment and protection, using his position of authority to coerce compliance. Ember's response demonstrated the courage that had made her such an effective scout. As she continued to draw out evidence while managing her own fear and revulsion, "What kind of responsibilities would such recognition involve?" she asked, her voice maintaining perfect control despite the horrific direction of the conversation. Warhawk's answer was so explicit and incriminating that several of the hidden witnesses had to restrain themselves from intervening immediately. He described expectations for sexual availability, requirements for secrecy, and threats about what would happen if Ember failed to meet his demands. "Women who fail to appreciate the protection they receive sometimes find themselves facing difficulties that could have been avoided," he said, his tone carrying the casual menace of someone who had used such threats successfully in the past. Immigration issues, questions about loyalty to the tribe, accidents during dangerous scouting missions, many things can happen to someone who makes enemies of those who should be their protectors. Chief Stoneheart felt cold fury building in his chest as he listened to Warhawk essentially confess to using his position to threaten and coerce women into sexual submission. The war chief was revealing not just individual crimes, but a systematic corruption of tribal authority that threatened the foundation of their society. The 5 council elders, all within hearing range of the conversation, were witnessing confirmation of everything they had been told in the sacred cave. Warhawk's own words were providing evidence that would be impossible to dispute or explain away, regardless of his political connections or military reputation. As Warhawk's behavior became increasingly aggressive, moving from verbal threats to physical intimidation, Chief Stoneheart decided that they had gathered sufficient evidence and that Ember's safety required immediate intervention. He stepped forward from his concealed position, his movement causing a ripple of awareness throughout the ceremony. "Warhawk," Chief Stoneheart said, his voice carrying the full authority of tribal leadership, "I believe this ceremony requires your attention." At the central fire, The interruption was designed to separate Warhawk from Ember, while maintaining the appearance of normal ceremonial business. But Warhawk's response revealed the depth of his arrogance and his confidence in his own untouchability. Instead of releasing Ember and moving toward the central fire as requested, he tightened his grip on her arm and turned to face Chief Stoneheart with an expression of barely concealed hostility. "Chief Stoneheart," Warhawk replied, his tone carrying subtle disrespect that would have been unthinkable in normal circumstances. "I am conducting important business with one of our scouts. Surely the ceremonial duties can wait until we have finished our discussion." The public nature of Warhawk's defiance of direct orders from the tribal chief sent shock waves through the gathered community. Even those who were not aware of the planned confrontation could recognize that something unprecedented was occurring in their sacred ceremonial space. Standing Bear stepped forward from his position among the elders, his presence adding weight to Chief Stoneheart's authority. "The ceremony cannot wait," he said, his voice carrying the moral authority of his advanced age and long service to the tribe. "And neither can justice." Warhawk's expression shifted as he began to realize that he had walked into a trap, but his arrogance prevented him from recognizing the full scope of what was unfolding around him. "What are you talking about, old man?" he demanded, his disrespectful tone toward an elder causing audible gasps from the assembled tribal members. Gray Eagle emerged from the crowd, his storyteller's voice projecting clearly across the ceremonial circle as he began to recite what he had heard. "I am talking about the words you have just spoken, Warhawk," he said, his perfect memory allowing him to repeat Warhawk's threats and demands with devastating accuracy. Thundercloud stepped forward with the moral authority of spiritual leadership, his presence signaling that Warhawk's crimes were not just legal violations, but spiritual corruption. "The sacred circle has been defiled by your presence," he declared, his words carrying the weight of religious condemnation. Wise Owl approached with several other tribal women, their collective presence demonstrating that Warhawk's crimes had been recognized and condemned by the feminine wisdom that he had systematically violated. "The women of this tribe have found their voice," she announced, her words carrying both grief for past suffering and determination for future justice. As the truth about Warhawk's behavior became clear to the assembled tribal members, the carefully maintained facade of respect and authority that had protected him began to crumble with stunning rapidity. Warriors who had served under his command looked at him with expressions of disgust and betrayal, while women who had suffered his attention felt the liberating power of public validation. Swift River moved to a position where he could intervene. If Warhawk attempted to use violence to escape the consequences of his exposure, his hunter's instincts recognizing the dangerous unpredictability of a cornered predator. Other loyal warriors took similar positions, creating a living barrier that would prevent Warhawk from fleeing or retaliating against his accusers. Warhawk's attempts to maintain his innocence became increasingly desperate and unconvincing as more evidence was presented and more witnesses emerged. His claims that he had been misunderstood or that his words had been taken out of context rang hollow in the face of multiple consistent testimonies and documented patterns of abuse. "These accusations are lies," he declared, his voice carrying the desperation of someone whose world was collapsing around him. "I have served this tribe faithfully for years, fighting our enemies and protecting our people. You cannot believe the word of women who seek to destroy a man who has given everything for our community." But his defense was undermined by his own behavior during the evening's confrontation, as dozens of tribal members had witnessed his predatory interaction with Ember and heard his explicit threats and demands. The evidence of his guilt was overwhelming and undeniable. Grandmother Willow stepped forward with her medical records, providing documentation that supported the testimonies and revealed the pattern of injuries that Warhawk's victims had sustained. Her clinical evidence added scientific weight to the emotional testimonies, creating a comprehensive case that addressed both the physical and psychological damage he had inflicted. As the full scope of Warhawk's crimes became clear to the assembled community, the harvest moon ceremony transformed from a celebration of abundance into a reckoning with the darkness that had been festering within their tribe. The sacred space that should have been filled with gratitude and joy became a courtroom where justice finally confronted the abuse of power. The night that had begun with ancient rituals of thanksgiving would end with the restoration of moral order and the promise that predators could no longer hide behind positions of authority in the Whispering Pines community. The sacred fire crackled with unusual intensity as dawn approached over the Whispering Pines settlement, its flames seeming to reach higher toward the heavens, as if the spirits themselves demanded justice for the crimes that had been exposed during the harvest moon ceremony. Warhawk stood in the center of the ceremonial circle, no longer the commanding military leader who had terrorized women in secret, but a broken man whose carefully constructed facade had been stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. Chief Raphael Stoneheart convened the emergency tribal council as the first rays of sunlight pierced the mountain peaks, calling upon the ancient laws that governed their people to address crimes that struck at the very heart of their community. The 5 elders who had witnessed the testimony took their positions around the sacred fire, their faces grave with the knowledge that their decisions would echo through generations of tribal history. Standing Bear rose to speak first, his weathered hands gripping the ceremonial staff that marked him as the senior voice of justice among their people. Warhawk, you've been accused of crimes that violate not only our laws, but the sacred trust that binds our community together, he declared, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. The evidence against you includes your own words, witnessed by dozens of tribal members, documented patterns of abuse, and testimony from multiple victims. Warhawk attempted one final defense, but his words rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence that had been presented. I have served this tribe with honor and distinction, he said, his voice lacking the conviction that had once made him a powerful orator. These accusations come from women who seek to destroy a man whose only crime was expecting respect for his position and authority. Thundercloud stepped forward with the moral authority of spiritual leadership, his presence silencing Warhawk's desperate protests. You speak of honor, but your actions have dishonored not only yourself but every warrior who has served alongside you, he said, his words cutting through the morning air like a blade. You speak of authority, but you have perverted that authority into a weapon against the innocent. Wise Owl's voice joined the chorus of condemnation, representing the feminine wisdom that Warhawk had systematically violated. The women of this tribe trusted you to protect them, and instead you became their greatest threat, she said, her words carrying both anger and profound sadness. You have broken something sacred, and that breaking cannot be undone with excuses or justifications. Gray Eagle stepped forward with the formal language of tribal law, his storyteller's training allowing him to invoke the ancient precedents that would govern Warhawk's fate. By the laws of our ancestors and the customs that have guided our people since time immemorial, you stand condemned of crimes against the sacred feminine spirit that gives life to our community, he pronounced, his words becoming part of the permanent record that would define this moment in tribal history. Swift River's practical voice added the military perspective that Warhawk had claimed to represent. A warrior's first duty is to protect those who cannot protect themselves, he said, his tone carrying the disgust of someone whose profession had been dishonored by Warhawk's actions. You have violated that sacred trust and proven yourself unworthy of the warrior's path. Chief Stoneheart rose to pronounce the formal sentence, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority that Warhawk had forfeited through his crimes. Warhawk, by the unanimous decision of this council and the evidence of your own actions, you are hereby stripped of all rank, authority, and position within this tribe, he declared, each word falling like a hammer blow against the morning. Silence. The chief continued with the traditional formula that marked the most severe punishment their society could impose. You are banished from the Whispering Pines territory. forbidden to return under penalty of death, and cast out from the community. Of the people, he said, his words echoing off the canyon walls. Your name will be struck from our records, your deeds forgotten, your presence erased from our collective memory. Grandmother Willow stepped forward with a medicine bundle that contained items representing Warhawk's former position and status within the tribe. One by one, she cast these symbols into the sacred fire, where they burned with flames that seemed to purify the very air around the ceremonial circle. Let the spirits witness that this man no longer exists within our community, she said, her voice carrying the finality of ritual death. Let his crimes be remembered only as a warning to future generations about the corruption that can poison even the most trusted leaders. Warhawk's supporters, those warriors and tribal members who had respected his military leadership, watched in stunned silence as the man they had followed was systematically stripped of everything that had defined his identity within their community. Some looked away in shame at their own blindness to his true nature, while others felt the bitter taste of betrayal as they realized how thoroughly they had been deceived. The ceremonial war paint that had marked Warhawk's status was ritually removed by thundercloud, each symbol scraped away as the spiritual leader pronounced words of purification and cleansing. The sacred symbols of leadership are removed from one who has proven unworthy to bear them, he intoned, his actions representing the complete severance of Warhawk's connection to tribal authority. Warhawk's weapons, the tools of leadership that had been symbols of his authority, were taken from him and distributed among other warriors who had proven themselves worthy of trust. His ceremonial regalia was burned in the sacred fire, the smoke carrying away the last vestiges of his former status. Ember Starwing stepped forward to address her former tormentor, her voice strong with the courage that had enabled her to survive his abuse and expose his crimes. You told me that no one would believe my word against yours, she said, her words carrying the power of vindication. You told me that your position made you untouchable. Today, the truth has proven you wrong on both counts. Singing Bird, Dancing Fox, and Mourning Dove joined Ember in a circle around the disgraced war chief, their collective presence representing all the women whose lives he had damaged through his predatory behavior. We are not the broken victims you tried to create, Singing Bird declared, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had reclaimed her power. We are survivors who have found our voices. Warhawk's final moments as a member of the Whisper in Pines tribe were marked by the complete collapse of the fear-based respect that had sustained his authority. The women he had terrorized now stood over him as symbols of justice, while the men who had once followed him turned away in disgust and shame. As the sun climbed higher over the mountain peaks, Warhawk was escorted to the eastern boundary of tribal territory by a group of warriors who had once served under his command. Their faces showed no trace of the respect they had once held for him, only the grim determination of men carrying out an unpleasant but necessary duty. Chief Stoneheart accompanied the exile procession to ensure that the banishment was carried out according to tribal law and tradition. You have 1 hour to cross our territorial boundaries, he told Warhawk, his voice carrying no trace of the friendship that had once existed between them. After that, you will be considered an enemy of our people and treated accordingly. Warhawk was given only basic supplies for survival: water, dried meat, and simple clothing appropriate for a man who no longer held any status or position. The symbols of wealth and authority that had once marked his high rank were left behind, consumed by the sacred fire or distributed among more worthy recipients. The boundary stones that marked the edge of Whispering Pines territory had been carved by ancestors generations past, their weathered surfaces bearing symbols that spoke of the sacred connection between the people and their land. As Warhawk crossed this threshold, he stepped from the protection of tribal law into the uncertain world beyond, where his former authority meant nothing and his survival would depend on his own diminished resources. Standing at the boundary, Chief Stoneheart spoke the final words that would sever Warhawk's connection to the only community he had ever known. "By crossing this line, you cease to exist in our world," he said, his voice carrying the finality of ritual death. "The man we once knew is dead, and the stranger who bears his face is forbidden to return." The procession that returned to the settlement moved with the solemnity of people who had witnessed justice served but took no joy in the destruction of a man who had once been their protector. The necessity of banishment was understood and accepted, but the pain of betrayal by someone they had trusted ran deep in the collective heart of the community. Chief Stoneheart gathered the tribal members in the ceremonial circle once more. But now his words focused on healing rather than judgment. "We have removed the corruption from our midst," he said, his voice carrying both sadness and determination. "Now we must work together to heal the wounds that corruption created, and to ensure that such darkness never again finds root in our community." The women who had suffered under Warhawk's predation were formally recognized as truth-tellers and courage-bearers, their status within the tribe elevated by their willingness to speak against powerful authority. Ember Starwing was honored with new ceremonial regalia that marked her not just as a skilled scout, but as a defender of justice who had risked everything to protect others. Grandmother Willow was appointed to lead a new council of women elders, their role being to monitor the treatment of women within the tribe and to ensure that positions of authority could never again be used to exploit the vulnerable. The medicine woman's wisdom and clinical perspective would provide early warning if patterns of abuse began to emerge among future leaders. The 5 council elders who had heard the original testimony and witnessed the confrontation were tasked with creating new protocols for investigating accusations against tribal leaders, ensuring that future victims would have clear channels for reporting abuse and seeking justice. Their experience in this case would become the foundation for protecting generations of tribal members yet to come. As the harvest moon finally set behind the western peaks, the Whispering Pine settlement began the long process of healing. From the trauma that had been exposed and the betrayal that had been punished, the ceremony that had begun as a celebration of abundance had become a reckoning with darkness. But it had also proven that justice was possible even when it required challenging the most powerful members of their society. The last image burned into the memory of every tribal member was not of Warhawk's disgrace and banishment, but of the women who had found their courage to speak truth to power and the community that had chosen to believe them rather than protect a predator. In that choice lay the hope for a future where authority would serve justice rather than corruption. Spring water cascaded down the granite cliffs surrounding the Whispering Pines settlement as Chief Raphael Stoneheart stood once again on his favorite observation point, watching the valley below transform under the gentle warmth of the season of renewal. The settlement had changed dramatically in the months since Warhawk's banishment, but the transformation went far deeper than the new buildings and expanded gardens that caught the eye of casual observers. Below him, Ember Starwing moved through the settlement with a confidence that had been absent during her months of suffering. Her new role as chief scout evident in the respectful way other tribal members sought her counsel and guidance. She wore ceremonial braids adorned with eagle feathers that marked her elevated status, but more importantly, she carried herself with the dignity of someone whose courage had fundamentally changed her community. The sound of children's laughter echoed off the canyon walls as a group of young girls practiced tracking skills under Ember's patient instruction, their eager voices asking questions about reading animal signs and moving silently through difficult terrain. Chief Stoneheart smiled as he watched the next generation of scouts learning from someone who had proven that courage was more valuable than any other skill. Singing Bird's hammer rang against her anvil with steady precision as she worked alongside her father in the expanded forge, their increased business, a testament to the tribe's growing prosperity and the restoration of trust in their craftsmanship. Her movements showed no trace of the fearful hesitation that had marked her behavior during the dark months of abuse, and her laughter could be heard throughout the settlement as she joked with customers and apprentices. Dancing Fox supervised the communal kitchens with an authority that spoke of someone who had reclaimed control over her own life, her organizational skills having been recognized and rewarded with formal leadership responsibilities. The meals she prepared had become legendary among neighboring tribes, who traveled great distances to participate in feast ceremonies that showcased the Whispering Pines' hospitality. Mourning Dove's weaving had evolved beyond traditional patterns to include new designs that told the story of the tribe's triumph over corruption, her artistic vision creating tapestries that would preserve the memory of their struggle for future generations. The Sacred Lodge now displayed her masterwork depicting the Harvest Moon ceremony, a visual reminder of the night when justice finally confronted evil. Grandmother Willow emerged from the newly constructed Women's Council Lodge, a building that had been erected specifically to provide a space where issues affecting tribal women could be discussed and addressed without interference from traditional male authority structures. Her appointment as the first elder councilwoman had created a new position of power that balanced the traditional leadership hierarchy. The Women's Council had already addressed several potential problems that might have escalated into serious abuse if left unchecked, their early intervention preventing the kind of systematic predation that Warhawk had been allowed to perpetrate for months. Their success had impressed even the most traditional tribal members, who recognized the practical value of having female perspectives represented in governance. Wise Owl had become Grandmother Willow's closest collaborator in establishing protocols that protected vulnerable community members, while preserving the cultural traditions that gave their society meaning and continuity. Their partnership had created a model that other tribal communities were beginning to adopt, spreading the influence of their innovations far beyond the Whispering Pines territory. The new governance structure included regular meetings between the traditional Council of Elders and the Women's Council, ensuring that decisions affecting the entire tribe incorporated perspectives from all segments of their community. Chief Stoneheart had enthusiastically supported these changes, recognizing that the strength they added to tribal decision-making far outweighed any challenges to traditional authority patterns. Swift River had assumed Warhawk's former military responsibilities, but his leadership style emphasized protection and service, rather than the dominance and intimidation that had characterized his predecessor's approach. The warriors under his command had embraced this new philosophy, recognizing that true strength came from defending others rather than exploiting them. Thundercloud had established new spiritual ceremonies designed to heal the trauma that Warhawk's crimes had inflicted on their community, creating rituals that honored survivors while acknowledging the pain that had been caused by betrayed trust. These healing ceremonies had become an integral part of tribal life, providing ongoing support for anyone struggling with the aftermath of abuse. Standing Bear had worked with Grey Eagle to document the lessons learned from their experience with corruption in leadership, creating educational materials that would help future generations recognize and resist the manipulation tactics used by predators. Their collaboration had produced a comprehensive guide to identifying and addressing abuse of authority that was being shared with tribal communities throughout the region. The settlement's prosperity had increased dramatically as word spread about the Whispering Pines tribe's commitment to justice and protection of the vulnerable, attracting trading partners and allies who valued integrity over mere military strength. The economic benefits of their reputation for fairness had surprised even Chief Stoneheart, who had focused primarily on moral considerations when making his difficult decisions. As evening approached and the settlement prepared for another peaceful night, Chief Raphael Stoneheart reflected on the journey that had brought his people from the darkness of hidden abuse to the light of restored justice. The cost had been significant: the loss of a respected leader, the pain of confronting uncomfortable truths, the challenge of rebuilding systems that had been corrupted by predatory behavior. But the benefits had far exceeded the costs, creating a stronger, more resilient community that was better equipped to face future challenges while protecting its most vulnerable members. The women who had suffered in silence had become powerful voices for justice, their courage inspiring others to speak truth, even when it challenged entrenched authority. Ember Starwing approached the chief's observation point as the sun set. Behind the western peaks, her presence a reminder of how much had changed since that morning when he first noticed the suspicious bruises that had started their investigation. "Chief Stoneheart," she said, using the formal address that marked official business, "the evening patrol reports no unusual activity in our territory." "Thank you, Chief Scout," he replied, using her new title with the pride of someone who had witnessed her transformation from victim to leader. "Your vigilance continues to keep our people safe." The exchange represented more than routine military reporting. It symbolized a restoration of trust between leadership and those they were sworn to protect. As darkness settled over the Whispering Pines settlement, the sounds of normal family life echoed through the canyon, children being called to evening meals, elders sharing stories around warming fires, young people laughing as they completed their daily tasks. These ordinary sounds represented the extraordinary victory they had achieved, the right to live without fear, to trust their leaders, and to believe that justice was possible even in the face of seemingly insurmountable power. The story that had begun with hidden bruises and whispered threats had ended with restoration, renewal, and the knowledge that courage could triumph over corruption when good people chose action over silence. In the growing darkness, the settlement's fires burned bright as beacons of hope, proving that even the smallest communities could become examples of justice for the entire world.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.